was watching TV one afternoon when I heard the doorbell ring. "Who's there?" I called out. I hadn't been expecting anyone. Silence answered my inquiry, so I got to my feet and lumbered over to the door. I looked out the peephole and saw a young woman standing outside. Sitting on the ground next to her was some sort of carrying case. Probably a saleswoman then. "I'm not interested," I called through the door, irritated.
"Please, open the door. Please,"
she said. She was difficult to hear, and her breathing sounded labored. I paused, considering. I thought about telling her to buzz off through the door. I didn't especially want to deal with her, saleswoman or crazy person. I had better things to do with my time. But what if she needs help? Asked a little voice in the back of my head. I groaned and closed my eyes. I couldn't leave someone out there in need. Not if I could help them. My mother's voice chimed in somewhere saying, "Do unto others as you would have done unto you." All right, I'm opening the door," I grumbled, ready to give her an earful if she was a solicitor. I opened the door and stood there, staring. She was wearing a sundress, the bottom half of which was dripping blood. Her bare arms and legs were cut up, and her feet were a bloody mess. How did I not see this through the peephole? There was blood seeping out of the carrying case next to her as well. With a jolt, I sprung into action. My instincts have always been good in a crisis, luckily for me. I scooped the woman up and carried her into my house, laying her on the couch. I called 911 while I grabbed my first aid kit and a handful of towels. I cut off the bottom half of the dress, just under her ribcage where the blood started. Deep gouges traveled the length of her abdomen. I wrapped a towel around her middle, holding as much pressure on it as I could. Still holding the towel, I clumsily wrapped the gauze around some of the worst cuts on her arms and legs. All the while, I spoke to her. "Everything is going to be okay. Don't you worry. The ambulance will get here soon, and they'll fix you. It's going to be okay. Everything is going to be fine. Stay with me. Can you hear me?" She didn't answer me. I'm not sure she was able to. Instead, she fixed her eyes on me while I frantically tried to save her life. She had the most beautiful green eyes I'd ever seen. I was desperate to save her. I couldn't let this poor woman bleed out on my living room couch. The police and EMTs arrived a few minutes later. They took over and got her in the ambulance, rushing her to the hospital, sirens blaring. A few policemen remained behind to look at the carrying case that was still sitting on my front step. After examining it for a few moments, they opened it. I shouldn't have been there when they did that. They must have forgotten about me. Or maybe these officers thought I'd accompanied the girl to the hospital. In the shuffle, I was overlooked. So I saw what was in there. From the box, one of the officers pulled out a man's severed head. The woman was identified as Tilly White. She had been missing for 6 months. The severed head belonged to a man named Stephen Cole, who was later identified as her kidnapper. He had kept her locked in his basement. Evidently, she had managed to get her hands on a knife and had struggled with him to escape. She'd stabbed him multiple times and then, as he lay bleeding out, sawed off his head. It was nearly unbelievable that such a frail and emaciated woman could saw off someone's head. I suppose the adrenaline had a lot to do with it. Then, she calmly packed his head in a case she found upstairs, left the house, and began going door to door, knocking and begging for someone to help her. I was the 5th door she had come to. Whatever else might have happened in that house, nobody will ever know. Despite my best efforts to save her, Tilly died on her way to the hospital. They were unable to revive her. I was hailed as a hero. but all I felt was an overwhelming sense of guilt. Stephen Cole lived right in my neighborhood, and I'd done nothing to stop him. I didn't know about what he was doing, sure, but I knew something was weird about him. Just looking at him gave me the creeps. More than once I thought about talking to someone about him, neighborhood watch or something, but decided against it. After all, what could anyone penalize him for? Being strange? That's just not how the world works. Now I wish I'd called, even without evidence. And because I didn't, this woman was dead. I didn't feel like much of a hero at all. Things eventually quieted down. After a few days, I was able to return home, the crime scene at my house having been cataloged and subsequently cleaned up. I received some heartfelt letters from the woman's family, but I declined to meet them in person. They seemed to understand, because they didn't push the matter. I got about a week off from work, which is more than I expected. But that week passed, and I had to go back to my boring, but mercifully quiet office job. Everything was normal as could be expected. And then, exactly 2 weeks after the incident, I woke to find police cars screaming up my street. They stopped at a house 4 doors down from mine, the house that was next to Stephen Cole's. I stood on my doorstep, watching as the police entered the house. They left with 2 body bags. Mr. and Mrs. Anderson had been found with deep gouges across their entire bodies. By the time the police were called, apparently some of the neighbors heard screaming. They had bled out and were stiff and stark. The case was declared a homicide. Our neighbors began muttering worriedly to each other. A patrol car was designated for our street to help set people at ease, and to catch the killer if he revisited the scene of the crime, as they so often do. A few quiet days went by. But the quiet couldn't last forever. The next screams came from the Stanton house, 3 doors down. The mother and father met the same fate as the Andersons. Their little girl, Amelia, was left unscathed. She was found hiding under her bed, and had not seen who ripped gashes in her parents' bodies. Our quiet little street was in an uproar. None of us missed the significance of what was happening. The wounds on the bodies were similar to those found on Tilly White. Naturally, the police suspected her family. Were they getting revenge because nobody on the street had been able to save their daughter, sister, cousin? As you can imagine, the investigation turned ugly. The Thompsons, who lived next door to the Andersons, left town. They decided to stay at their summer home down south for a few days, at least until they felt safe coming back home. I wished I could go with them. I was starting to feel nervous, living on my own and all. The news came 4 days later. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson had been found murdered. Their bodies had been discovered by one of their 4 children. The same gashes decorated their skin. They'd lived 2 doors down from me. I barely left my house those days. The world seemed to be going crazy around me. I went to work, I came home, I locked my doors, and drew my curtains. I didn't speak to anyone, other than the occasional police officer who came by to see how I was doing and ask if I had seen anything suspicious. Just 2 days after the Thompsons were murdered, old Mrs. Paulson, who lived in the house next to mine, was found murdered. I'm sure you can guess as to the state of her body. It was clear I was to be next. The police stationed several patrol cars outside my house. They were intent on catching whoever was doing this, someone who had somehow managed to evade all their best efforts so far. They assured me that they wouldn't let anything happen to me. but I knew what fate had in store for me. I spent those next few days in agony, preparing for my own death. I made sure I had a will, that I'd spoken to my parents and told them that I loved them. I'd written out my funeral specifications, and I wrote letters to everyone important to me, to find after my death. Then, all that was left was to wait. 3 days after the last murder, the knock came at my door. I swallowed hard and rose to my feet. Who was out there? Was it a man, or was it something else? I walked to the door on shaking legs, nausea burning in my stomach. Who's there? I called. There was no answer. I stepped closer to the door and looked out the peephole. There she was, standing at my door just as she'd done a few weeks ago. But this time, she looked different. The blood and the gashes were gone. Her green eyes were bright and clear. She was looking up at the peephole with a solemn look on her face. She gave me a small smile.
"Thank you,"
she whispered. I shouldn't have been able to hear it through the door, but I did. It sounded as though she whispered it right into my ear. Surprised, I unlocked the door and yanked it open. But Tilly White was already gone. That was the end of the murders on my street. It's been 5 years since then, and nobody was ever caught or identified as the killer. The case remains open, but I don't think anyone will find the answers they're looking for. As for me, I know what happened to the people down the street, and I know that I'm lucky not to be one of them. And one thing is for sure. Until the day I die, I'll always answer the door for a person in need.